All right. How's everybody doing? Good? Can you hear me all right? Good. All right. So, Linda was in the Kootenays. So, in fact, Revelstoke, right? Is that what Revy is? I don't know the short form for Revelstoke. I think that's what you're talking about, I would think. Um, Rossland's great. Fernie's good. Rossland's my fave. Nelson's my fave. Rossland's the second. We're this point here about salmon spawning. Perfect lead into what we're going to talk about tonight, which is the circular economy. So, anybody ever heard of the circular economy before? Heard of what it's all about? Yeah. Uh, and the circular economy. So, why do you think I'm talking about this now? Circular economy. What's so relevant with the circular economy right now? I could have had the same lecture 5 years ago, talked about the circular economy. But the reason why I'm choosing to do it now is because it's actually happening now. There's been a lot of much, it's needed more than ever, but it's also becoming like a thing now. People actually are doing it or thinking about it and crafting policy. And this is not an idea that's brand new. Like it's not like someone just came up with circular economy this year. It's been around for a while, and I'll talk about that. But what's I find quite fascinating is that now people are thinking. I hear it all the time: circular economy, circular economy, circular economy. Whereas you couldn't pay someone to talk about it in government 5 to 10 years ago. Like you just wasn't there. So it's exciting in that sense. The time is right for it. So for those that aren't familiar with the circular economy, I'm going to put through some resources so you can see what it's all about. Here's a link that talks about what it is. It's from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And basically based on three principles: design out waste and pollution, to keep products and materials in use, so keep them going, and then regenerate natural systems. So this whole idea of regenerative economies are the principles of the circular economy. So here's a good system diagram of what goes into the circular economy, or how people try and represent that physically. And it's a neat idea. So I guess first point I have is, what is it about at a fundamental level? Like, what do you think is the most basic part of the circular economy? It's a question for you. Is it that we use circles a lot? What would you say is the main kind of idea behind it? Maintaining scarce resource is one part of it, yes. But when we have to use those resources, there we go, that's getting it. Closed loop systems, so that we have wastes become resources, right? So the output of one system is the input to another system. That's one of the things about it, is making sure that whatever we produce can kind of feed into another process, so we don't have like this ongoing kind of take resources, utilize them, and spit out garbage, essentially linear process, which that's the linear process. So it boils down to looking at things systematically, where waste becomes a resource, right? So what formerly was a waste product is now becoming something that has value in this supply chain. So this isn't actually a new thing. Although it sounds like really innovative and new, it's not. It's an idea that has been bumped around for a very, very, very long time. I don't even know how long it's been bumped around, but a long time. And in my kind of era of study, it's been around for a long time, like in the last 20 years. So, um, but the interesting thing is, it's gotten a lot of traction as of late. So as of late, this whole idea of the circular economy is really catching fire, right? So, but in terms of the fundamental underlying thinking, um, it's about designing processes or products even with this kind of cradle to cradle mindset. So you're designing from inception all the way to the end of use of something. And in some cases, it's more clear cut when you deal with specific products because you can design something for end of life, right? So one guy, and some of you, I think we've talked about it before, who has done a lot of work in this area and is attributed to like the founder of cradle to cradle thinking is William McDonough. So anybody heard of William McDonough before? Some of you have mentioned it too before, I think, but others may not have heard of him before. So I would recommend looking at his work. McDonough is a really interesting guy. So him and his partner, who was a chemist, and McDonough's more on the design side of things, came up with this idea of cradle to cradle thinking and cradle to cradle design. And in fact, have taken it to the point at which they have like a certification process and so forth. So technically, cradle to cradle could be considered an environmental management tool as a certification, right? So McDonough's thinking is a big part of this whole idea, the underlying concept of like thinking about the end of life of something. Now, ideally, the end of life of something can be utilized for something else. Therefore, it keeps on being a resource that has value. Whereas in other cases, it may just be done, but we want to make sure that we can reuse whatever we have, whatever the raw materials were. Another school of thought that is, I would say, that's an underlying principle of the circular economy is the natural step. Has everybody heard of the natural step before? Some of you have. So the natural step, again, it's like a framework for going about how you run an organization or a process. So I'd recommend taking a look at the natural step. Now the natural step is, I think it's very interesting and it's been around for a while. Like the first time I saw it must have been in 2000, or sorry, not even, yeah, maybe 1999, around there. And I thought it was really cool at the time because it was a little different than your standard ISO 14000, management system and so forth. It was more philosophical in a way, and it was developed by a scientist in Europe who was looking at the health of children and the impact of pollutants on the health of people. What I found interesting about him and the approach, the early stages of the natural step, though, was the fact that he looked at that problem and tried to think of it metaphorically, tried to think of a cell, like how do cells operate? Cells are quite efficient in the way they use resources. Like everything, most things are recycled or fed into another process as a start product. So I like that metaphor. And what he did was, based on his understanding of that, went about and wrote out the different principles of what a natural step, a natural process or organizational methodology is. And the neat part I found was that rather than just come up with something in isolation and say, this is it, he developed it and then peer reviewed it. Like he sent it amongst a variety of different people and kept on going and going and going and going and peer reviewed 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 until there was no real pushback, right? Because the first time you send something out, someone's got something to say about it. Oh no, I don't really agree with that because of whatever. Whereas in his process, he just sent it out so many times iteratively by the time that he just kept on doing that until there was no significant feedback or refutation of that methodology, which, in the sciences is kind of rare, right, to get that situation. So the natural step, I mean, as a process, I think is quite interesting and something to look at. Now, it hasn't quite got the impact and uptake that I would have liked, but I think it's a good example to look to as like this foundational set of principles that relate to the circular economy. And then one other thing that I think is interesting, that I think is a part of this fundamental thinking that goes along with the circular economy, is biomimetics or biomimicry, and not entirely, but partially. So here's a link. So has anybody read about biomimicry, biomimetics? Yes, no? Yes, good. So biomimetics is basically looking towards nature and designing how things fit with, um, can be emulated, how our designs can be emulated from a review or a look at natural systems. So, I mean, if you look at the book, there's a book called Biomimicry that I'd recommend reading and looking at, where they document certain inventions and so forth that were inspired by nature. So one of them is very high tensile strength materials that are based on the strength of spider webs, right? That's one classic example of the protein structure in spider webs. They examined that and said, hey, you know, it works in a certain way. Let's make these materials based on that. And so similarly, you can look at all kinds of different natural systems and look at how they're, you know, how they work, and then mimic that in the design in order to optimize resources and so forth. Because often in biological systems, they're optimally produced systems. There are systems that operate based on optimal use of resources. So biomimetics, I think, is an important component of this whole idea of a circular economy. Now, there's other couple things I'd like to throw in there that are relevant but at a different scale. Okay? Has anybody heard of James Lovelock before? James Lovelock. Yes, no? No. Okay, good. So at least you're going to get something out of this tonight. So if you haven't heard of James Lovelock, he is someone you must know about, right, if you're working in this field. So James Lovelock is attributed as the founder of the Gaia hypothesis. Has everybody heard of the Gaia hypothesis? No. Okay. Wow. This is worth coming out then tonight. So the Gaia hypothesis is it's a hypothesis. It's a proposition that the world, the Earth, is actually a living system. And not only the biosphere in ecosystems and so forth, but the abiotic components as well. So the Gaia hypothesis argues that because the Earth system operates in such an integrated manner, so for instance, the way thermohaline circulation works and atmospheric processes and so forth, that it is almost like a living system, even though components of it are technically not alive. You understand what I'm saying? Like the function of the ocean is not necessarily due to biological processes. Rather, there's a series of different abiotic processes that cause things to work the way they work in a certain balance, right? Atmospheric homeostasis, right? The energy balance of the Earth, for instance. All these different factors that components of the way the biogeochemical cycles of the Earth and so forth are like, according to the Gaia hypothesis, are like the circulatory systems of a human being. So atmospheric homeostasis keeps things in balance, like keeps the energy balance in check. Now, of course, if we disrupt that to a certain degree, we can see things go off kilter. And so Lovelock worked in atmospheric science, and part of the motivation behind that Gaia hypothesis is to look at how these homeostatic mechanisms are working, and also indicate that if we disrupt these homeostatic mechanisms too much, they can result in pretty severe damage, right? They can push it out of a certain state of comfort. So here's a link. Take a look. That's a YouTube video of James Lovelock. He's famous, so I mean, good to know about James Lovelock and look about and learn about the Gaia hypothesis. So if any of you have ever taken global biogeochemical cycles like the oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so forth, and the energy cycle of the Earth, probably you've done some of that in if you've looked at atmospheric science or meteorology courses, at least in the water hydrology and the energy balance of the Earth. You'll see that these kind of dynamic processes arguably could be attributed to a living entity, hence the Gaia hypothesis, right? So, I mean, when you think about this, these are what I'm trying to get at is this is the macro view. So the macro view of that is that you have this this kind of broad view of how things are in balance, right? And then the last component that I would argue that's related to this whole idea of a circular economy is the planetary boundaries model, okay? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the planetary boundaries model, but if you're not, take a look at this link here. These links will be available in the downloadable notes as well, so if you're not getting this, don't worry about it. And this planetary boundaries model, how many people know about the planetary boundaries model? Some of you do. I know that for sure. Some in 415 may not, but if you don't, this is an important thing. So in essence, the planetary boundary model takes that whole Gaia hypothesis and puts it into like little slivers, like say, okay, well, there's certain things that the Earth needs in order to function properly, right? Like for instance, it needs an atmosphere that is stable, right? We need to have nutrients cycling properly. We need to have a certain level of biodiversity in order for things to function properly, biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at that link, you'll see that there's different kind of slivers, I guess, if you will, of how the Earth system works, and these components need to operate effectively. And what they do, and what I would consider somewhat revolutionary about the planetary boundaries model, is that it allows us to look at this whole Earth system thing in a practical policy standpoint, and then put some science to it to say, okay, well, if we're going to look at if we determine that atmospheric stability is an important part of how this stuff works, then I would say that we need to make sure that we stay within safe boundaries, hence the boundaries, right? If we disrupt it so much, like in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, we enter into this kind of red hot danger zone with respect to how the atmosphere works, right? So in that era, in that component of that planetary boundary, if it's in that part, we're in danger because heavy disruptions can occur. So like a very high frequency of high energy storms, sea level rise, droughts, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, biodiversity and ecosystems, if we degrade biodiversity and ecosystems to an extent that they're highly unproductive, our food systems can collapse, right? Hence this kind of framework to keep us in a safe carrying capacity of the Earth system. So these are do you see the connection between the macro view of how this whole Earth is working and planetary boundaries and the Gaia hypothesis, which is still kind of more esoteric way of looking at that, whereas the planetary boundary a little more scientifically functional. But we need to have that broad perspective on things in order to then zoom in to how we're operating in order to make some changes or suggestions. And this is where we come in as environmental scientists or environmental professionals. Okay, so we have these kind of broad view and these kind of ideas about circular economy, planetary boundaries, and the Gaia hypothesis. But then we have to look at this, okay, well, that's all fine. You can say to me, okay, Dave, that's fantastic, but what do we do then? What do we do then if we want to keep our planet working, right? Because we know that there's some pretty significant challenges we're facing with climate change, biodiversity, nutrients is crazy as well. So that's where we kind of put our environmental management tools hats on and say, okay, well, let's get to work. Let's try and figure out what we can do in order to kind of keep us within these safe boundaries, right, on the planetary boundary side of things. So circular economy is then this one kind of framework idea that can actually mobilize action around how we do economic planning and create policies that can then, help to control the emissions and so forth that can dramatically affect negatively our status of key processes that keep us safe and stable. So what's Canada doing then if we're going to look at this operationally? This is why I said this is interesting, right? Is that there's actually a lot of traction happening right now on the part of national governments with respect to the circular economy. So if you go to this link here, this is the current Canadian policy on circular economy. So they have, what is circular economy? Learn more about it. Canadian business and the circular economy getting involved with and there's a circular economy forum in 2021. So it's an event. We'll look at. It's held in Toronto, Ontario, at the Beanfield Centre, September 13th to 15th. And this is going to more and more people to start to at different levels. Where does the Ellen MacArthur Foundation fit in? They're simply as a definition. So I mean, for them, they're doing projects related to the circular economy. I use their link as just a definition. Okay, there's various other definitions as well. They had a good one. So if you look at their system map for circular economy, I think it's pretty good. So if you take a look at that site, you can see the various different activities and definitions that the Canadian government is establishing. So why is this important? Why am I even mentioning this? So you can see it looking at this link here. If you go to this is the detailed definition of how the Canadian government is articulating what the circular economy is. They lay out what they see it as. So design. In a circular economy, products are designed to be taken apart or recycled easily by the original manufacturers. Companies can adopt this approach, often focus on aspects such as building components for a longer overall product life, using highly recycled materials, chemicals, and eliminating the use of harmful chemical substances, and having processes to refurbish and remanufacture used products, and offering collection points for products at the end of life, right? So what does that sound like? Like, what does that definition sound a heck of a lot like? Like that could have been written by William McDonough, right? It's basically what they're articulating is cradle to cradle design, which is a part of the definition in Canada of the circular economy, which is good. So manufacturing, circular opportunities at every stage of the production cycle. So from the way raw materials are extracted, processed into goods, used by consumers, recycled, identifying ways to retain the value of components that make up things we use, and allowing companies to find green, more sustainable options, and to extend the use and value of, to extend the use and create value. So a good company that is a great example of this is Patagonia. So I know that some of you actually written papers on Patagonia, but they're a good example of really trying to embody the circular economy through extending the use of products, offering repairs, encouraging people to buy less, right? Patagonia literally does that. Say, buy less of our products. It's kind of brilliant strategy from a business standpoint, because you create a set of values around what you're doing. And people who stick with Patagonia, they stick with Patagonia. All right. Recycling, obviously taking things back, even like metals, alloys, and then reusing those materials in new processes. And then waste, businesses are finding ways to capitalize on waste materials, repurposing, upcycling, people say. Many companies are recovering process valuable materials like industrial wastewater, scrap materials, organic waste products, and electronic waste. That's a whole area of endeavor in the circular economy way of doing things. Okay, so you have this. Here's a forum that I think they'll probably do it virtually coming up. It's hard to say. We'll have to see what happens. But this is something I would recommend getting up to speed on and hopefully becoming part of. You only really get involved or up to speed on these things if you get involved, if you go to the events, right? So note to yourself here, think about either attending these. Many of these will be done virtually going forward. Okay, so that is an event on the circular economy, and it's great that it's happening because you don't used to have this. So, I mean, that's kind of at least in Canada, something that's happening in the endorsement at the federal level. But I guess I like to look at things operationally, and the question is this happening at a smaller scale, right? What do you think? Have you seen anything at a smaller scale that is clearly circular economy oriented? Question. Have you seen a company doing it? Have you seen a city doing it? Something where it's tangible. I have seen this, and it looks like that's circular economy. I don't know. There's a carpet company that's recycling and taking back their products at the end of use, that kind of thing. Have you seen anything like that? Hear a lot of talk? Exactly. There's a lot of talk, but what I want to show you then, which is a good point, thank you for giving the segue into what I'm going to show you, is some case studies and examples. So here's one link here from a group called the C40. Have you heard, anybody heard of C40 before? No one's heard of C40. Good. So C40 is actually a very interesting thing. I'd recommend taking a look at it, especially for work purposes. C40 is, it's a climate initiative for cities. So I believe there's 40 cities, hence they call it the C40, that have decided to take on the climate challenge and then try and address climate change in a variety of different ways based on the different cities involved, right? And I believe Vancouver is one of the C40 cities. So C40 cities connects 94 of the world's greatest cities to take bold climate action, leading the way towards a healthier and more sustainable future, representing 700 plus million citizens and 1/4 of the global economy. Mayors of the C40 cities are committed to delivering on the most ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement at the local level, as well as to cleaning the air we breathe. Okay, so it actually, I believe it started with 40 cities, but now obviously there's more. There's, they say there's currently 94 cities. And this, I believe, was started in Paris at that COP and then has since grown. And what it is, it's a challenge for cities. Often get lost in the macro perspective, like, oh, everybody, countries have signed on to the Paris Accord, but really the cities are saying, look, we want to get going. We want to reduce our emissions. We want to be carbon neutral. And they're not tied in, they're not constrained as much as national governments. Yes, I know Vancouver is C40. I don't know about the other ones, and Montreal might be as well. If you look at that link I sent through, it should, it should say, or if you go to the C40 website, just a sec, I'm going to check really quickly. That's a good question. Okay, c40.org. I'm going to go here. Cities. I want to get an answer to your question right away. Okay, so if you go here, this will take you to C40. This is the C40, only Toronto, right? I could have sworn that affiliated cities, there's, just a sec, I'm gonna, okay, good. So we've got the diffs east. I'm just gonna go quickly. I want to find Latin America. So they have it organized. Montreal is one. Okay, I'm looking at the list for Toronto and Vancouver. So it's Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And within each, they have like an emphasis on energy, transportation, water, and then I don't know what the other icon here stands for. Air quality, adaptation, implementation, air quality, food, waste and water, transportation, urban planning, energy and buildings. Those are the 5 components of it. So if you go to this website, you can see all of the different cities that are connected into this. And it's interesting, because well, go to there and you'll see which ones are doing what. And there's some really neat things going on. And what I like about the C40 initiative, it's very tangible. So like Dana was saying, like you hear a lot of talk about this stuff, but at the city level, it's hard to BS what you're doing at a city level, right? You have to actually implement stuff. It may not be the most popular thing all the time. I know, for instance, in Montreal, what they're doing with traffic and parking and that kind of thing with closing off streets for bike lanes is highly unpopular with a lot of people. But nonetheless, it's a very tangible and demonstrable part of what their environmental policy is, okay? So the C40, this document I just showed you, lists a variety of different circular economy roadmaps and so forth related to different things they're doing. Like in the Amsterdam, they're dealing with the construction value chain. That's how they're managing it. Brussels, regional program for a circular economy called Be Circular. And so they give you a list of all that they're doing. They're Cape Town, South Africa, industrial symbiosis program. So in that sense, they're looking at how their industries can work together in like an industrial ecology standpoint. We have Copenhagen, resource and waste management planning. Glasgow, inspiring businesses to innovate and be future-proof. Gothenburg, Sweden, circular Gothenburg. Helsinki. So there's a lot of different cities that are doing neat stuff, and it will vary dramatically depending on which city you're dealing with. So a great resource there, C40 alone as an organization, as well as the actual circular economy work that they're doing. So those are some pretty good examples. And then here's a couple other ones. Like here's Toronto's. So Toronto's is looking at recycling organics, long-term waste strategy, and working towards a circular economy. So this is Toronto's circular economy program. So you can take a look at that to give you a better idea of what Toronto is doing. If you look at that, you can see transition to circular economy provides opportunities to enhance social and environmental outcomes, improve economic performance and profitability, decrease the risk associated with relying on an external source of raw materials and labor, and increase the resiliency of the city services and infrastructure. So you can see they've got this kind of framework they've put in place there where they articulate how virgin raw materials feed into this whole circular process with including resource recovery. So another good example of tangible efforts that are being made. I already mentioned the Glasgow, but here's their actual program, Glasgow, a circular economy program, and you can see the reports and publications. So in each city, it kind of varies quite a bit how they interpret it and what they do, right? So what does this actually mean then for what practitioners are doing, right? So you could potentially go and apply to work with, the city of Vancouver or what have you. However, regardless of what you end up doing, so if you're kind of embarking to work on environmental management tools, this is where it really hits the tires hit the pavement, right? So for those in 415, what we're going to be covering and those in other courses, the tools that are a part of environmental management practice are the things you use in circular economy activities, right? So for instance, when we're implementing an environmental management system like ISO 14000, that will allow you to put in a framework and documents and procedures and processes for a company that will allow them to be a participant in a circular economy, knowing what your emissions are, knowing what your resources, your impacts are coming out of the pipe, and then attempting to use those either as a feedstock into another company or another process, or recycling them and reusing them internally, right? So an environmental management system is really the micro version of trying to create a circular economy in a company or an organization. Similarly, a life cycle assessment, that's another environmental management tool that we'll be looking at, that others have looked at, that is the process by which you take a product or service and look at it from the cradle all the way to the grave, from inception, raw materials, creation, extraction of those raw materials, processing, fabrication, use, and then end of life. So that whole kind of value chain of use, then you need to use an LCA, life cycle assessment, to document analytically what is happening at each one of those stages, and then circle that back. So you don't really know what the impacts of the whole thing are unless you look at the LCA of it, how it kind of feeds back into the process. So that's going to be very useful we need to use LCA to realize a circular economy. It's a prerequisite. We need to have environmental management systems for organizations in order to understand what these environmental wastes are, and the resources we need. Okay, certifications as well, I think, are a useful environmental management tool in this context, because certifying something like, say, timber, for instance, or organic fruit, or whatever it might be, an ecological or environmental certification really puts the due diligence into establishing whether or not some product was produced in an environmentally benign or detrimental way, right? So those kind of certifications for products and potentially services as well, again, they fit into this whole idea of a circular economy. And by getting up to speed and learning how to do it, like how to identify aspects, how to identify impacts, how to rank significance, and then how to determine what some mitigation processes are, that will allow you to then function in this new era of the circular economy. And I can guarantee you that the circular economy is the next thing. Like now this is going to become the norm. And therefore, when something becomes a norm, much like, say, mobile communications or what have you, or a low carbon economy for that matter, that's when all this, the work needs to get done. And the work in this case that needs to get done is that of proposing, designing, implementing, and monitoring various types of environmental management tools, such as an EMS, life cycle assessment, eco-certifications, and so forth. All right, so that's kind of the broad view of what this whole idea of a circular economy is like. But what I was hoping to achieve tonight is to give you this kind of broad view, like actual definitions, and how this fits into the Earth system, and then also take that down in scale, all the way down to like a country, but then also to city level and an organizational level, so that you have tools at each stage to see how, how it works. Like, how do we deal with a circular economy when we're working for a company, when we are living in a city or doing city planning, where we're doing provincial planning. Like, you could look at an SEA as well, strategic environmental assessment, as a necessary environmental management tool for that kind of policing, planning, and programming component of circular economy activities. And then also at the organizational level. So I want you to understand the importance of environmental management systems like ISO 14001, or like if you wanted to do a natural step type of thing, or what have you, or a B Corporation certification, to this overall picture. You can't have, we can't stay within planetary boundaries and endorse this kind of massive atmospheric stasis at the global level without having the actual on the ground actions at an organizational level to really understand and reduce those impacts, right? So what you do in this course, and those that aren't taking the course, have taken the course, fits in with that big picture. It fits with the Paris Accord, because there's often a disconnect. Say, oh, those policy people, all those countries, they go hang out in Paris and they have a big meeting and everybody claps, but then nothing happens, right? Well, that may be the case, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is the case, right? By having these tools and knowing how to use them, you can look to that stuff, which I agree with you often is rhetoric, but take that and then implement that at various different levels of government and organizations, okay? So for those in the course, that's what we're going to be doing. That's what we are doing now. For those that have already taken the courses or similar courses, this is how it fits with the circular economy. And those who haven't taken the courses and aren't taking this course, this hopefully was a kind of just a broad view of how this stuff works together, and it's important, and it's really important. And then also it gives you the fuel to say, when you hear this from, say, like, I don't know, a senior level bureaucrat or a senior level politician, you can ask them, say, okay, well, if you're proposing the circular economy, what role does ISO 14001 have in this? And then that will most likely stump them. They'll probably say, what are you talking about? Okay, but you'll know, and you'll be able to answer that, and you'll be the pro. You'll be the pro. All right, any questions? C40 is good to look at. I'd recommend checking them out heavily. Dig into that. These city plans are real as well, and there's a lot more of them. But if you look at the C40 document, you'll get a lot more ideas. The Canadian one is a kind of thin, the policy, so I don't expect a lot if you go and hope to have your life changed by looking at the Canadian federal government's circular economy page. It's not that. There's not that much there yet. All right. Is the biomimicry book recently released? No, it's an old book, right? Who knows when that book was released? I think it was, could have been even early 2000s. Mind you, it's evolved. Like the initial book, I'm just going to get the initial. Here we go. Biomimicry, even this cover is different than what I remember it to be. Just a second, I'm going to send this through. So she's got some great YouTube videos out there and stuff like that. When was this first released? Just one sec. I'm trying to find. 2002. So it came out in 2002. I think it may have been earlier though. I'm not sure, but I always remember reading it earlier than that. So even in this, so you know how Amazon recommends books, right? So frequently bought together. Guess what's bought together with this? Of course, Cradle to Cradle, and also The Upcycle by William McDonough. And I think The Upcycle is a newer book. 2013, yeah, that's the newer one. So Cradle to Cradle. So here's Upcycle. This is one of the new things is upcycling here. So that's the Upcycle book. And then this is Cradle to Cradle. Just a sec. Send this link through. Cradle to Cradle. So Cradle to Cradle is 2002 as well. So Cradle to Cradle is kind of, it's been around for a while, obviously. But those are good ones. Those are good things to look at as foundational aspects. So the idea of biomimicry is not new. And in fact, if you go, I mean, you could go back further, right? Look at, you know, various inventors have always looked to nature as a way of being inspired and trying to replicate it. You could also say the airplane is biomimicry, right? There's an argument to be made for that. I mean, obviously it's become more refined. And the stories and the examples that she uses in her book, spider webs and so forth, are really like, you really see some deep analysis of something, of a natural phenomenon that that has been inspiration for this kind of human-made creation. I'm doing a project right now where we're looking at, like, I'm proposing we use a biomimetic approach with kind of you know, things working together like a beehive. Actually, that's what I'm looking at, the example of how bees and ants work together through base communication to achieve a bigger goal. I can't go into much more detail, but it's a biomimetic approach is what I'm suggesting we take with this project, which is quite interesting. Okay. Other questions? So tonight you've got some good stuff. James Lovelock, even that is worth the price of admission. He's a legend. And the Gaia hypothesis is legendary. Legendary by being criticized and legendary for inspiration. Like the pure ecology people love it. They're like, oh my God, it's Gaia, balance, blah, blah, blah. And then the hardcore atmospheric scientists, they hate it. You know, hardcore, they're like, that's not true, it's not living, blah, blah, blah. And then the other component, C40 is a really practical thing. And then also the natural step, I think, is really for you to know about as well. These are the things you want to have in your toolkit. So when you walk into a situation to, like, just, I don't know, have that knowledge. This is trade knowledge. This is stuff you want to know as a pro, as a practitioner. All right. Any other questions? Are you going to go out and do circular economy stuff now in your home, right? Take your organic matter and grow vegetables. Uh, Good. Audible. Yeah, you can probably get those books on Audible as well. This is popular stuff, so I think you can find it well worth reading. I would say definitely worth your time. Good. Okay. I will post the notes with the video. So if you want them and you didn't get them here, at least like the main notes, I won't. I will post the chat, but you can, the chat will allow you to get access to these URLs. All right. So thanks for coming out. Hopefully it was useful. At least you know tomorrow you can walk into a meeting and tell someone about the circular economy and have some meat behind you now, if you didn't have that before.